The year was 1347. The world was already trembling beneath wars, famine, and unrest. But no one knew that a shadow was sailing silently across the seas, a shadow darker than any sword or empire could bring. It began with whispers, stories carried by merchants from the east. They spoke of a mysterious illness that emptied entire towns, a sickness that left bodies swollen, blackened, and broken. Few believed them. After all, travelers were known to exaggerate. But what if this time, the stories were true? In the autumn of that year, a fleet of Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people rushed to greet them, hoping for exotic goods, silk, and spice. But when the sailors staggered onto the docks, the crowd froze in horror. Their faces were pale, their bodies covered in oozing boils. Within days, many were dead, and with them, death itself had arrived in Europe. The disease spread faster than the mind could grasp. First Sicily, then mainland Italy. From port to port, the shadow moved, hidden inside rats and carried by fleas. It traveled in barrels of grain, inside ships' holds, in the very fabric of the clothes traders wore. And soon no city was safe. But in these first days, people didn't yet understand. They thought it was punishment from God. Or perhaps, a curse cast by enemies. Priests urged repentance. Doctors bled their patients. But the deaths only grew. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of 14th century Europe. The air thick with the stench of waste, animals, and humanity pressed together. Fleas thrived in the filth. Rats scurried underfoot, unseen yet everywhere. And in this environment, the plague found its perfect kingdom. At first, the symptoms seemed small. A fever, headache, fatigue. But then, the buboes appeared, painful swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck. Black spots dotted the skin. The pain was unbearable. Within days, sometimes hours, the victim was gone. Entire households perished. Whole families vanished. And still, the disease marched on. But here lies the terror. No one could escape it. Rich or poor, young or old, noble or beggar. The plague did not discriminate. Kings trembled, priests prayed, and peasants wept, yet all fell alike. Rumors filled the air. Some claimed the Jews had poisoned wells, sparking violence and massacres across Europe. Others believed the end of the world had come. And in many ways, for them, it had. By early 1348, the plague reached France, then Spain, then England. Trade routes, once symbols of prosperity, now became veins pumping death into every corner of the continent. Picture a medieval port town at sunset. Ships anchored offshore, their sails torn, their decks eerily silent. People stand on the docks, afraid to board, but too late. The disease has already slipped ashore. Within weeks, the marketplace is empty. The church bells toll endlessly, ringing for the dead. The streets, once filled with laughter and cries of children, echo only with silence and the occasional wail of grief. And yet, the shadow still spread. Messengers carried news faster than the disease itself. A town has fallen. Thousands dead. The priests cannot bury them all. But always, the same warning followed. It is coming here. People tried to flee. But flight only carried death to the next village. Families locked themselves inside their homes, hoping isolation would save them. But when the rats came, scratching at the doors, survival became a lie. Doctors, powerless and afraid, wore strange beaked masks filled with herbs and flowers, believing sweet smells would drive away the poison. Their black cloaks and glassy eyes made them look like specters themselves. And often, when they entered a house, they left with more corpses than patients. By the winter of 1348, Europe understood. This was no ordinary illness. This was a force that could unmake kingdoms. Entire regions were reduced to wastelands of death and decay. And yet, this was only the beginning. Pause for a moment. Imagine the fear of those first weeks. A neighbor falls ill. His skin darkens. His cries echo through the night. The next morning, his house is silent. His wife and children vanish soon after. And you are left wondering if tonight will be your turn. The Black Death had arrived, and it would not leave for years. But the question remained, how far, how deep, how devastating could this shadow become? The whispers were no longer rumors. They were prophecy. The plague was here, and Europe's world was about to change forever. But if this was only the beginning, what horrors awaited in the cities, where thousands lived side by side, trapped with death itself? The year turned to 1348. Europe was trembling. The whispers of doom had become screams of despair. And in the great cities, where people lived shoulder to shoulder, the plague found its richest harvest. Picture Florence, one of the wealthiest cities of Italy. Its markets overflowed with goods, its churches glittered with gold. But when the plague arrived, all that wealth meant nothing. In a matter of weeks, Florence transformed from a city of art and trade into a city of silence. The bells tolled day and night, but soon even the priests could no longer keep up. Corpses lay in houses, in courtyards, even in the streets. At first, families tried to bury their dead with dignity. But as death spread faster than shovels could dig, the dead were piled into mass graves, one on top of the other. Some were even left unburied, rotting in the heat, poisoning the air itself. And still, life went on in twisted ways. Some people locked themselves away, hoping strict isolation would save them. They ate carefully, spoke little, and prayed constantly. Others gave up completely. They drank, feasted, and indulged in every desire, believing death was certain, so why not embrace it? But none of it worked. The plague spared no one. In Paris, the university's best physicians debated endlessly over the cause. Was it bad air? A curse of the stars? A punishment from heaven? They argued, wrote long reports, and made predictions. But as the streets filled with corpses, the people saw the truth. The physicians were as helpless as anyone else. London, too, fell to silence. A bustling city where ships from across the world once brought wealth, now saw only ships bringing death. The narrow lanes of London, already choked with waste, became breeding grounds for the rats and fleas that carried the invisible enemy. And soon, whole neighborhoods vanished. Can you imagine the fear? You hear coughing outside your door. A knock, a plea for help, but you dare not open. For to let them in is to invite death into your home. And yet, to leave them outside is to watch your neighbor, your friend, perhaps even your brother, die in the street. The plague was merciless. In some towns, half the population perished in just a few months. Priests refused to perform last rites. Gravediggers abandoned their posts. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. The bond of family, of community, shattered under the weight of survival. Venice, proud Venice, with its canals and trading fleets, tried to fight back. The city imposed one of the first quarantines in history. Incoming ships were held offshore, their crews forced to wait 40 days before entering. Quarantaggiorni, they called it. And from that word, we still say today, quarantine. But even these measures were not enough. The rats did not wait 40 days. They slipped ashore in silence. And Venice, too, was struck down. Some claimed the very air was cursed. Fires were lit in the streets, filled with herbs and perfumes, in hopes of purifying the atmosphere. People carried posies, flowers, or sweet-smelling spices to ward off the bad air. But the scent of roses and lavender could not drown out the stench of death. Everywhere, fear gave rise to anger, and anger gave rise to violence. Rumors spread that outsiders, especially Jewish communities, had poisoned the wells. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were burned alive, victims of fear and hatred. These acts of cruelty only deepened the darkness, showing how fragile humanity became when death walked beside it. And still, the plague spread. By the summer of 1349, it reached the northern edges of Europe. From the ports of England, it crossed the Channel into Flanders and Germany. From there, it moved along the Rhine, creeping into every village, every castle, every monastery. Monks, once devoted to prayer and service, watched their brothers fall one by one. Whole monasteries stood empty. Libraries of precious knowledge were left abandoned, silent, as the last monks coughed their final prayers into the cold night. But perhaps the most haunting sound was not the toll of the bells, nor the silence of the markets, nor even the wails of the dying. It was the sound of carts, wooden carts, creaking through the streets, loaded with bodies. Men called death collectors moved from house to house, shouting, "Bring out your dead." And from every doorway, bodies were carried out. Husbands, wives, children, friends, all thrown together into the cart, destined for the mass graves outside the city walls. Some resisted. Some still hoped. But the truth was undeniable. The plague was not just killing people. It was unmaking entire societies. Town councils collapsed. Guilds disbanded. Trade routes fell silent. And across Europe, people asked the same question. Would anyone survive? Pause here and picture it. A world where every breath feels dangerous, every handshake a risk, every night a gamble. A world where the most advanced cities of the Middle Ages, symbols of progress and pride, now lay still as graveyards. And yet, the plague was not done. Because the true terror was not only death itself. It was what death left behind. What happened to faith when priests abandoned their flocks? What happened to law when rulers fled their cities? What happened to love when even family ties were broken by fear? The plague was not only killing bodies. It was corroding the very soul of Europe. And in that silence, in that endless darkness, something was about to break. But in the face of despair, faith and fury began to collide. Some clung to God, others cursed him. And across Europe, humanity itself stood on the edge of madness. By 1349, Europe was drowning in grief. The plague had taken millions, and still it spread like wildfire. Yet death alone was not the only horror. In its wake came madness, faith twisted, fear unleashed, fury unchained. Humanity itself began to fracture. For some, faith was the only refuge. Churches overflowed with desperate souls, praying, fasting, begging God for mercy. In towns across Europe, people marched in great processions, singing hymns, whipping themselves bloody in penance. They believed their sins had brought this punishment, and only through suffering could salvation come. These men became known as the flagellants. Dressed in rags, they walked from village to village, chanting and striking their backs with iron-tipped whips. Blood ran down their bodies as crowds watched in awe and terror. Some saw them as holy men, chosen to cleanse the world. Others whispered they spread the plague themselves, carrying death from town to town. But in the chaos, no one truly knew. Meanwhile, other voices rose in anger, not prayer. Rumors spread like fire through dry grass. The Jews have poisoned the wells, people said. They are servants of the devil. Fear turned to fury, and fury turned to slaughter. Entire Jewish communities were massacred across Europe, burned alive in Strasbourg, drowned in Mainz, exiled from countless towns. These were not just acts of violence. They were acts of despair, humanity lashing out against a foe it could not see. But if the faithful clung to God, others abandoned him completely. What kind of God would allow such suffering? What kind of God would let innocent children die in the arms of their mothers? For many, faith shattered like glass. Churches stood empty. Priests, too afraid to give last rites, fled their parishes. And when even the shepherds abandoned their flock, the people asked, "Who will save us now?" Across the countryside, strange cults began to rise. Some claimed visions, others promised secret cures. Charlatans sold potions of herbs, stones, even crushed emeralds, swearing they could ward off the plague. Many believed, for hope was worth any price. But hope was always followed by disappointment. The plague cared nothing for charms or promises. Fear made neighbors into enemies. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Strangers were turned away with stones. In some towns, guards patrolled the streets, forcing the sick into plague houses where they waited for death. Families were torn apart, parents abandoned children, children abandoned parents, all to survive another day. Yet even in the darkest moments, there were sparks of courage. Some priests remained, tending to the dying, giving comfort to the hopeless. Some doctors risked their lives to learn, cutting open bodies to study the disease, searching desperately for answers. And some ordinary men and women, despite their fear, chose compassion, caring for neighbors, feeding orphans, burying the dead. Their names are forgotten, but their deeds were not. Still, the plague showed no mercy. In cities like Cologne, Prague, and Vienna, entire neighborhoods vanished. The air stank of smoke from mass pyres. Dogs and crows feasted on the unburied. The living walked with haunted eyes, as if death itself stood at every corner. And through it all, the question echoed, why? Why us? Why now? Astrologers pointed to the heavens. They claimed a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had poisoned the air. Others said earthquakes had released deadly vapors from the earth. But science could not comfort a grieving mother or explain the silence of a city. Only one thing seemed certain. The world had changed, and it would never be the same again. The fury of man, too, reshaped the land. In towns that once bustled with trade, houses stood empty, abandoned forever. Fields went untilled, harvests rotted, and famine crept alongside the plague. Wolves prowled through deserted villages. Forests reclaimed farmland. Nature itself seemed to rise from the ruins of human despair. Yet amid destruction, something unexpected was happening. With so many dead, power shifted. The old structures of society, lords, priests, guilds, were weakened. Peasants, once powerless, suddenly found their labor in demand. Wages rose. Feudal bonds began to break. The plague was not only ending lives. It was ending an age. But no one saw this yet. In 1350, all they knew was fear. Fear of tomorrow. Fear of each other. Fear of a world that no longer felt safe, or holy, or sane. Pause here, and imagine yourself in that world. Every day, the choice is the same. Faith or fury, hope or despair. You hear the drums of the flagellants in the distance. You smell the smoke of burning homes. You see the cart rolling past, piled high with bodies. And you ask yourself, how much longer can humanity endure this storm? The Black Death was no longer a disease. It was a trial, a fire through which the soul of Europe was being forced to walk. Some would emerge scarred, some broken, some remade. But no one would emerge unchanged. And still, the question remained. If the world survived, what kind of world would rise from the ashes? And when the plague finally loosened its grip, the survivors looked upon a transformed land. A land of ghosts, but also of opportunity. The darkness had passed, but what new world had it left behind? By 1353, the great wave of death had begun to ebb. The plague had raged across Europe for nearly 6 years, leaving behind a trail of devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. More than a third of the continent's people, some say half, were gone. Towns stood empty. Villages vanished. Whole families erased from memory, as if they had never lived. The silence that followed was almost worse than the screams. Imagine walking through a marketplace once crowded with voices, and hearing only the wind. Imagine entering a church built for 1,000 souls, and finding only dust and shadows. The survivors lived in a world of ghosts. But out of that silence, something new began to stir. For while the plague had stolen lives, it had also broken chains. The old order of Europe could not stand unchanged after such loss. The feudal system, which had bound peasants to the land for centuries, began to crumble. With so many laborers dead, the survivors found themselves in demand. Landowners, desperate for workers, offered higher wages, better conditions, even freedom. For the first time, the poor had leverage. And many seized it. Some walked away from their villages, seeking new opportunities in towns. Others bargained boldly with their lords. Europe was shifting, slowly but surely, toward a new age. The plague also reshaped faith. The church, once the unshakable pillar of medieval life, had been shaken deeply. Priests who fled were remembered as cowards. Those who stayed often perished. And when prayers failed to stop the plague, many believers questioned the power of the church. Doubt crept into the hearts of the faithful, planting seeds that, in time, would grow into great movements of reform. But not all turned from God. Some survivors grew even more devout, clinging fiercely to faith as their only anchor. Pilgrimages increased. Relics were sought with greater passion. Yet beneath it all, the unquestioned authority of the church had cracked. And once a crack appears, the wall can never be the same. Culturally, too, the world began to transform. With so many dead, a strange urgency filled the air. Life felt fragile, uncertain, fleeting. Artists painted with darker themes, filling their canvases with images of death, skeletons, and the dance of mortality. Writers captured the despair, but also the resilience, of those who lived. From this darkness, the seeds of the Renaissance began to grow, a rebirth of thought, art, and science that would, in time, remake the world. Economically, trade routes shifted. Some cities never recovered, their streets too empty to thrive again. Others, less affected, rose in power, reshaping the map of commerce. Italy, though scarred, eventually surged forward with wealth and creativity, paving the way for a new era of exploration and invention. Yet even as the survivors looked to the future, they could not escape the shadow of the past. The memory of the Black Death lingered in every empty chair, every abandoned home, every grave without a name. Parents told their children of the years when death walked the land, warning them never to forget. And though the plague would return in smaller waves over the centuries, it would never again strike with the same fury. But what it left behind was more than scars. It left a new world. The old bonds of feudalism weakened. The authority of the church questioned. The value of human labor recognized in a way it had never been before. The Black Death had not only destroyed, it had transformed. Pause for a moment and think. All of this, from a tiny flea biting a rat, carried unknowingly across the sea. A chain of events so small, yet so unstoppable, that it reshaped the destiny of continents. The survivors bore heavy grief, yes. But they also carried something else, resilience. They had seen the worst, and they had endured. Their children and grandchildren would inherit not only their sorrow, but their strength. From the ashes of the Black Death, Europe rose into a new age. An age that would give birth to the Renaissance, to revolutions, to the modern world itself. Without the plague, history might have followed a different path. With it, humanity was forever changed. So when we ask, what was the Black Death? Was it merely a disease? A punishment? A curse? Or was it the turning point of history, the darkness that gave way to light? Perhaps the truth is all of these. The Black Death was terror. It was silence. It was despair. But it was also the spark that broke the chains of the past and forced the world to begin again. And even now, centuries later, we remember. We remember not only the millions lost, but the way their suffering shaped the world we live in today. The plague ended, but its shadow still lingers.